which I will present, and I will ask Trey Kelly, if he will, to chair the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you just mentioned, we're looking forward to hearing the final work and the effort that you put in on Senate Bill 402. We know it's something that's important for all of us, that as we came back from rural Georgia from our homes, we certainly understand the importance of Senate Bill 402.
All right, Senate Bill 402 is the Senate broadband bill, and it's been combined with the Senate EMC bill, so that they're now one combined bill. And it passed out of subcommittee on Thursday. And so what I'd like to do is just to go through the changes that the subcommittee authorized on Thursday, and then open it up for any questions from the committee. All right, on page 4 of the bill, on line 79, at the request of the Georgia Technology Authority, we restored the original Senate language so that line 79 now reads, "The department, in consultation with the Georgia Technology Authority, shall have the authority to plan for," et cetera. So that is a change that we spoke of in the subcommittee meeting on Thursday.
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
can I ask what's the LC number?
This is LC 363674S.
You said page 4, right?
It's page 3, line 79.
Okay.
Page 3.
Oh, right. Mine's a marked up version, so I'll go by line numbers. All right, on line 351 and 352. My lines won't match up either. Okay. All right. Sean Murray.
I can call him out.
Yeah. All right, on page 11, line 351 and 352, this was the change that was requested by Kevin Curtin of AT&T to make clear that we are not expanding beyond the current law in the interconnection requirements. All right, in the definition of unserved area, which is on line 746 on page 22, we had a group of census tracts, or one census tract or a group of census tracts as long as they were contiguous. Stephen Lofton of the Cable Television Association pointed out to me that census blocks are smaller than census tracts, and that census tracts are actually made up of blocks, and that it might be more appropriate to use census blocks for our unserved areas. And then, and I'm going to speak to Senator Gooch about this, because one of the concerns from the providers is that our requirement that it be 20% or more unserved locations constitute an unserved area, that's kind of going to be difficult to enforce, and it really doesn't match up with what the FCC does. And so by going to the smaller blocks, that we may be able to avoid having to use that 20% requirement. So we have changed that to unserved area means a census block. And then when we talk in terms of the grant program, we say that the grant may be made to one or more unserved areas as long as they're contiguous. So the sense of the language doesn't change, but we've made it a little bit more understandable and probably a little bit more usable. So that change has been made. on the next page at line, excuse me, 767, at the request of the Georgia Technology Authority, we allowed, 767, we added structures to make sure that when we do an analysis of the State Properties Commission properties, that we're actually interested in structures that may be available to utilize in a broadband network setting. And then on 7, what, Shumry?
It's on, 786.
On line 786, we allowed that DCA and GTA could make their report jointly rather than each one of them having to make a separate report. In 50-3922, which is on line 842 on page 25, we just define that rather than saying should be designated when we're talking about map challenging. We're talking about, rather than unserved areas, we just said you're challenging that the map should be designated differently than on the current map, and then you don't have to put whether it's served to unserved or unserved to served, just say differently. And then the grant area, we talked about one or more contiguous unserved areas rather than just dealing with unserved areas now that we've gone down to census blocks. All right, then in 50-39-100, which is when we're talking about the co-locations and the FCC rate. There's two new definitions. Oh, I'm sorry. We're on page 33 on line 1130. And Sean Marie can explain this better than I can, but everywhere else in the bill we define broadband as 24/3. But in this particular section, it's defined as just being a wired or wireless terrestrial service that consists of the capability to transmit in either the upstream or the downstream direction to end users, in combination with such service provide access to the internet. But it doesn't have a speed. So there is a new definition. Huh? On 1130, there is a speed of advanced broadband service, but the definition of broadband service on 1139 does not have a speed. And everywhere else in the bill, broadband service is defined as 24/3, but not in this particular section. So we've got a new definition for advanced broadband service. And then on line 1161, we define FCC rate, which everywhere else in the bill where we have previously used FCC rate, we have gone through and said the FCC rate as defined in code section so-and-so of the Federal Communications Code. And so rather than do all of that, we put in a definition for FCC rate so it's easier to read everywhere else that FCC is used. And so those are two new definitions. And then for the first time, we define on 1179, we define served area as being a census block that is not designated as an unserved area. Imagine that. And then 50-39-102 has the FCC rate, and that's on, starting on line 1214 on page 36. And it basically has three components. On 1215 in A1AI, it says that an authority, which could be an EMC or a city, in an unserved area will apply the FCC rate for advanced broadband. So any provider that wants to provide advanced broadband in an unserved area will pay the FCC rate. And then in 2AI, it says that the rates and fees charged by an authority in a served area, and you have to read all of this, 2AI, 2, Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, to get the gist of this. But it basically deals with two scenarios. One is you're in a served area, which means there's already advanced broadband being available, and the EMC or the city now wants to provide service in that area as well. And if they do, they have to drop their pole attachment rate to the FCC rate in any area that they go into. So if, say for instance, Worth County is a served area, and Mitchell EMC, which is the membership corporation down in my part of the state, wanted to serve that area and it was already being served, then they would have to make all of the poles that they are serving or in the area where they're serving FCC rate poles to level the playing field and not have an unfair competitive advantage. That's scenario number one as far as a served area. Scenario number two deals with the North Georgia area where you've already got two EMCs that are in the broadband business. And in those two areas, they have to do the same if somebody wants to provide advanced broadband, but only to new locations. In other words, if there are existing locations that are currently being paid at something other than the FCC rate, those would continue because that was part of their business plan when they put in their broadband service. So those are the changes on that. And then the final change is on line 1256, which just basically says, because all of this is predicated on what's served and what's unserved. And until we have the maps, you can't tell what's served and unserved. And the maps are supposed to be available January 1, 2019. So this particular article that deals with the FCC rate in served and unserved areas would not be effective till January 1, 2019. So those are the changes that were made, that we discussed at the subcommittee meeting and made over the weekend and are presented to full committee along with the original document that passed out of subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Questions on number 13?
Mr. Chairman, other than the ones you just mentioned, could you give me just a brief comparison of where we sit now as to 887?
Actually, they're very similar. They both have the grant component. They both have the mapping component. One of the main differences in the two is that in 887, the GEMA was the lead agency on everything. They did the mapping, they did the grant program, they did the broadband ready community certification and model ordinance. The Senate version had the Georgia Technology Authority being the lead agency, but had DCA doing the grant and the model ordinance, which is what they're more capable of doing. And so we actually kept that framework intact because it actually makes more sense than 887. A couple other differences in the two is that in the Senate version, they had, in addition to the broadband ready community, which was in both versions, in addition to that, they had a provision regarding gigabit sites that they could be promoted by the Department of Economic Development on its website and in its promotional materials, so that somebody coming to Georgia looking for a particular type of broadband access would be able to find it promoted on that site.
Representative Teasley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the 2AI, the lines 12, 29 and following. I represent Cobb County, and so, for instance, Cobb EMC is an area that area that serves a lot of my district, as a matter of fact. So I see, if I understand correctly, it says if, for instance, Cobb EMC decided to get into the broadband business, if they had a co-location on, they would have to match the FCC rate on an area that they served, but not necessarily the whole region. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was some disagreement about what the intent of the Senate version, which actually provided this arrangement. But the EMCs and Senator Gooch both agreed that it was only for the area that the EMC encroached into somebody else's area that would have the FCC rate, not the entire area. Like, for instance, where I live, the local EMC serves all or a portion of like 3 or 4 counties. And to say that they have to offer the FCC rate on their entire footprint if they just went into one community or one area would be probably a deal killer for this.
Okay.
Chairman Parsons.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Wanted to ask you, and I came in here with this version that was being considered in subcommittee, and then it's a different version here. So I've been kind of reviewing the other one, but in the version that y'all were at least considering in subcommittee the other day, it had, and I can't even find this in this bill, I guess it's in here someplace, but it had identified in the definitions, and I don't even know if this is even relevant in this bill, but it had a definition for qualified broadband provider, and
That has not changed.
okay. Then if that hasn't changed, I don't know where it's at, but if I could ask you this. It says under B, under that definition, an electric membership corporation, a political subdivision of the state that is able to demonstrate financial, technical, and operational capability to operate broadband services. I would submit that no political subdivision of the state has that, could demonstrate that, but how would that be proven anyway?
Well, I think what we were looking at, we had 2 basic provisions. One where you're already in the business and you have been in the business, and the second, which is the one you're referring to,
Right.
is when somebody wants to get into the business. And primarily what we're focusing on there is to keep the fly-by-nights that just want to get a state grant and then disappear and waste the money. So the first consideration is we want somebody that's got some degree of permanency. Second of all, you would want somebody who's got a business plan that has gone through their due diligence to say, all right, we have surveyed the need, we've surveyed the number of providers in the area, we've surveyed what we can charge. In other words, you've done your due diligence, and that we have somebody who is going to manage it for us, or somebody that we are going to hire to manage it. In other words, you've got to show that you've done what it takes to get into the business. But the primary importance is the permanency. We want somebody who has been here, who is going to be here, that's going to, have staying power, so to speak.
Right, well, I would understand that completely, but it does say political subdivision of the state that is able to demonstrate financial, maybe, technical, and operational capability to operate abroad. And I don't think any of them would have that, but I don't know how, they would have to hire consultants. And I don't even know how that would be, how would that even be considered? I don't.
Well, I think that part of what we do here is that we leave it up to the agency to some degree to use some discretion. But like I told you before, if I've gone out there and I have arranged for my financing, I've got a business plan, so I know how much it's going to cost. I know how many customers per mile there are, and I've factored that into my equation. And I've hired somebody, or I've got somebody who is ready, that has expertise in the business, that's ready to manage it. I'm not just picking up Joe Blow off the street corner. I think that with all of those things, I have demonstrated that I'm taking a serious approach to this, not a fly-by-night approach.
Okay, well, I thank you for that. I would just submit that I think that would only be what they would have to, the only thing that they could demonstrate is that they've hired consultants to put something together for them. But I wanted to ask, if I may, one more.
Sure.
I think the way that this is written, that any kind of a grant program would be dependent on the appropriations process. Isn't that correct?
Well, appropriations or else funding from other sources such as One Georgia Authority or federal funding.
Okay. Then my question is, since that would be, I mean, hopefully it would cover everything that we need, but it's probably not even near what it would be. But is there anything, what would actually prevent discrimination or partisanship toward the local governing authorities when it comes to appropriate? I mean, not appropriating the money, that would be but through the process of actually putting the grants out or making the grants. Is there something in here that actually would, I fear that the local governing authorities would be the first to get that money?
Well, we've got criteria in here at number one that you've got the demonstrated ability. But primarily what we're looking for is and there are specifics in the bill that say that when they make an award, they are supposed to give priority to whether it's a broadband area community that is going to be served, whether there is a demonstrated need in public safety or hospital aspects, whether what kind of down and upstream speeds they propose, what kind of pricing that they intend to do, what kind of service area they intend. So you've got all of these priorities in there so that you don't just say, we've got this great proposal from these folks that are going to do a 50-10 downstream, upstream, and are going to charge $25 a month, and are going to go in there and only want $200,000 grant, and yet we're going to prefer somebody that can only do 25-3 and want more money. I mean, the priorities are there. So I don't think that you're going to be able to just overlook somebody and say, I like local governments better than I like private providers. I don't see that happening.
Okay. Could I ask one more question? I'll stop after that.
Yes, sir.
This one should be a pretty easy one. On the EMC.
The other two were easy too.
Okay. Thank you. Regarding the coverage that the EMCs can provide broadband to, it shows, in addition to their coverage area, it shows a 5-mile radius. I'm not even sure what exactly, I know what a radius is, but I'm not sure what that would mean. Like, I guess a radius would be from the center, I guess. But what is that? What is that? Why is that in there? And what exactly is that they can provide?
That's the original. That is the original Senate language, and what it intended to do was to apply that EMCs would be on their assigned area or their territory that's in the Territorial Service Act, that they could serve that territory and within 5 miles outside of that territory. So in other words, if I've built a tower or a repeater at some point, I don't have to necessarily stop at an arbitrary line, that I can serve over that line but no further than 5 miles over that line. The other thing that it says is that if I am, and I will give an example again of my area, you've got Mitchell EMC that serves all of Mitchell County and part of Worth County and part of Doherty County and I think part of Baker County. And if the neighboring EMC did not want to get into the business and Mitchell EMC did want to get into the business, but the neighboring community wanted to provide broadband, then they can partner with Mitchell EMC to come into their territory, but it has to be contiguous. And so there is the ability to go beyond 5, but only in partnership with another EMC.
I would hope they wouldn't be putting up towers. That's not the strength that they have been identified to provide. That would not be the tool that
We have not chosen a technology, so if fixed wireless were to provide the best bang for the buck, then they would be able to do that if they could demonstrate that it was reliable.
I'm just saying that's not their strength that they have identified to us, the reason they want to get into the service.
Representative Pate.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, just a quick question, I think. I want to make sure the grant monies that are given, that their purpose and intent is for one-time capital expenditures and infrastructure. I'm assuming that's the intent. It looks like there's a couple of I'm sorry.
It says that.
Okay, well, it looks like there's a couple of spots in the language. If you look at line 215, where it talks about that the grants can be used for operation, repair, and maintenance of emerging communication technologies.
What line?
215. And then there's another line, once you get to that one, where it talks, the paragraph is talking about that the grants are authorized to apply for, utilize grants.
Yeah, that's not talking about our grants.
Okay, all right.
In
so-
other words, it says an EMC is authorized to provide and operate emerging communications technologies, and they can apply for, accept, repay loans, grants, other financing from the federal government. So
Okay.
in other words, it tells you what they can do. This is not our grant.
Okay, all right. So your intent is for the grants that we're giving
Our grant is limited to capital or capital leases.
and not operations and
That is
normal
correct.
routine
That's correct.
operating expenses?
Yes,
Okay,
sir.
okay. Just want to be clear of that. Thanks.
All right. Vice Chairman Harrell.
This, I'm going to start on page 7, dealing with cross-subsidization, starting on line 221. And this dealing with EMCs, this bill still differs a bit from the version of 232 with regard to the territories and poles. But we've added the language at our last discussion in the last subcommittee, or even before. We were concerned about this cross-subsidization, and we added language about the generally accepted audits, and I see that. So that's a good, strong addition, a good addition, I see. But I don't see where that audit or that documentation is provided to DCA or whoever the governing authority is that's going to review it and confirm from the state's perspective that that cross-subsidization is not occurring. Is that, or is there a mechanism I missed?
According to, I think when we were discussing this with Legislative Council, one of the things that's required if EMC gets in the business, that they've got to get a license permit. It's listed in the bill from the Public Service Commission, and part of that permit requires not that they cannot cross-subsidize. So it is my understanding that the PSC could require that audit to assure that they are complying with that provision.
All right, sir. And then I'll move to, I believe it's page 22, roughly line 745, and you discussed this a little bit earlier with regard to unserved areas, and the discussion continues about potentially removing the 20% requirement. Do we anticipate that'll be a rules committee modification?
No, actually, I wanted to talk to Senator Gooch about it as far as it has been in our version in 887, and since we got 402 over here, it has been in both the Senate and the House version that the 20% requirement. And I don't propose to remove that, but I am saying that if the Senate wants to remove it when it goes back to the Senate, now that we're dealing with blocks rather than tracks, I don't think that that would be problematic.
All right.
But I do not intend to remove it.
Okay. Well, the following page on 23, the modification, which is roughly line 767, 768, at the request of GTA, to add the word structures. It was my understanding from GTA's testimony that one of the concerns, in addition to participating with State Properties Commission, was that the size of this investigation could be very laborious and very costly, and the original language said all state assets, including not limited to real property. So that seemed very expansive. Adding structures, further expands the debate. And I understood their testimony to be concerned about the cost in this area.
First of all, that this is the original Senate language,
Right.
other than the fact that we added structures. But there's no timeline on this like there is on mapping.
Okay.
And so if it later turns out to be problematic, then certainly we can address it next year in the legislative session. But, you know, if State Properties doesn't know what they own, then they probably need to. So, so I don't think that it's gonna be as big a problem as they indicated that it would be.
Okay. If I may continue, just a couple more on line 796 and 797 on the next page. And I appreciate that the information provided will be held confidential. And we're potentially inviting a number of private enterprises in to participate in this and to make huge investments in the state. And that information ought to be confidential. However, we're also inviting the government, local governments, to enter into this proposal, funded via tax dollars. And my question is whether or not that information should remain proprietary. We have expanded what can be discussed in executive session already this year with regard to certain sales tax information that would be provided to local governments beyond what was previously acceptable to be held in executive session. And this provision would also, I think, at least in this area, expand the information that local governments could refuse to disclose.
I don't know the answer to that question, but my guess would be is that even if this is protected on the state side, that if it's not protected at the local side, that if I want to get a copy of whatever they are doing, I can do that from the government side.
I think that I guess my only final comment would be that with the unserved and served definition and the ability of the state agency, DCA, to make that determination, I do still have some concern that we have not been as prescriptive or preemptive or mandate enough of the requirements that there remains room for
What
advantageous.
specifically are you saying that we have not mandated?
Well, I think the program itself, with regard to how the grant funds are going to be determined, I think there's a tremendous more flexibility there. Again, using the served and unserved areas in that. Again, with the balancing act between local governments, EMCs, and private sector, I think there's some opportunity there for some gamesmanship. But I know this is a very difficult issue to craft and has been for a long time. But you know, again, I just have that reservation. Again, it was a statement; it wasn't a question. But
Okay.
Chairman Martin.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, real quick, when the DCA is deciding how to do the grant on the serve the unserved area with the least money, I know your intent is to try to get this out to as many people as possible in that underserved area. Is DCA going to come up with a process and rules and regs relative to that? I mean,
They're going to have
somebody
They're
like
going to
you
have
said,
to.
you
I
don't
mean,
want somebody come in for
what the
a few
bill
$100s.
says is it tells DCA what we consider important. Number one, 25-3. We're looking. We don't want just somebody that's a step above dial-up. I mean, we want to make a meaningful change. Number two, that you can't just cherry pick. That if you're going to serve, you've got to serve everybody in that area. You can't just go to this subdivision and the people that live, 3/4 of a mile from the subdivision get left out because there's not enough density. So we've set some parameters in here about speed, about reliability, about the technology being scalable, which means that you don't want to invest $5 million in an area and then 2 years from now that technology is out of date. You want it to be expandable. So we've provided in here that they give preference to technology that is scalable. And so that if the technology later will support 50-10 or 110, that then it's not gonna require a rebuild of the system, you just have to upgrade the technology. So we have put in some things in here specifying what we think is important, but we haven't told them how to go about doing the program. That's what rules and regs are about.
We've had extensive work, and the whole state of Georgia will certainly benefit from this. The bill's now before the committee. Seeing no further questions, and I'll entertain a motion. We have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a motion. We have a second. Any discussion?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to say, as discussion, you know, my fear is we've got agencies with no expertise in this area at all. We've got them designing programs, putting together maps, and trying then to qualify local governing authorities on whether or not they have the expertise and can provide broadband service. To me, that's just problematic. But with that, that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, seeing no further discussion, all those in favor make me know by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. The bill passes unanimously. On the rules. No other business for say we are adjourned.